Now I'd like to briefly outline some key sociological themes that will come up throughout the course. We'll be doing specific weeks on class, race and ethnicity and gender, but also the concept of power is a very key thing that we need to consider throughout the course more generally. So to begin with, class is a conceptual way of understanding inequality. Obviously inequality in society, it's an empirical fact in the sense that some people have more stuff than others, they have more money than others, they have bigger or better houses and cars than others and this kind of thing. So that's the material relationship of class, and we'll be looking at that aspect when we look at Marx and Weber later on in the course. Class is not a popular term in mainstream society. In fact, it's largely denied. Politicians and media tend to ignore it and hate talking about it. But it is one of the key concepts of sociology for thinking about how inequality works. It doesn't just have material and economic factors, it also has cultural factors, such as things like tastes, morals and values, tend to pertain to what the middle class likes and thinks and wants. So we'll be looking at this kind of stuff in particular in the week that we look at class, but it'll also be implicit in the weeks on youth and consumption. For instance, the language of class is when you use the terms hipsters and bogans. These things relate to cultural conceptions of class, where the hipster tends to have these middle class tastes around organic beer and one coffee from one country or whatever, whereas the bogan is seen as to be a more vulgar form of consumption that drives a Commodore and drinks VB or whatever. When you use these terms, you're actually describing class relations. You can see one relates to the middle class, one relates to the working class, and you can see there's value judgments going on when those terms are being used. And again, this is implicit in thinking about how class works, about who has power and who doesn't, about who gets to make the world more in their own image and who doesn't. So again, this is kind of implicit in our day-to-day relations, and the concept of class wants us to help think about this and unpack it and critically engage with it. Another key sociological concept is gender. Gender relates to the ways that society set up certain norms around male and female, and here gender is about notions of masculinity and femininity. It's a way of thinking about the nature-nurture debate in terms of how much of ourselves are biology and how much is culture, and we can think about gender through notions of socialisation in particular. The ways that boys are given Tonka trucks and girls are given Barbie dolls, blue and pink and that kind of thing. There's even some studies show that the way that babies are handled is fundamentally different depending on their gender. A male will handle a male baby much more roughly than if they know that the baby is female, and these things have obviously implications on socialisation. So gender here is a key concept in sociology to think about those kind of socialisation processes, and more broadly to think about inequalities in terms of things like education systems, workplaces, unequal pay, and that kind of thing. Increasingly, gender relations and sexuality itself has become a key area in public politics, and you can see this through expressions of things like the Me Too movement, public moral panics around things like Gamergate and the like. It's very important to think about sex, gender and sexuality as three very different things, and we'll go into that in some detail in the week that we look at sex and gender. Race and ethnicity is also a key sociological theme. These concepts are very different, race being a scientific category and ethnicity about cultures and traditions. The very concept of race itself is increasingly seen as bunk. The science seems to show that categories we saw in the past as being separate in terms of genes and things like that, there seems to be as many differences within what we called races in the past to between them now. So the very concept of race itself has become quite questionable. But obviously notions of racism still largely permeate our societies. So in a place like Australia, we have a rising Islamophobia and a rising fear around different cultures, and this is particularly the case in a kind of globalisation and post-September 11 world. So ethnicity as a concept is a way to help us think about the differences between people in terms of understanding cultural norms and traditions and religions. But sociologists are increasingly interested in how, as globalisation happens and migration is more and more normal around the world, how there's kind of a mix of people living in multicultural societies and the way those relations play out and the way the power works in terms of regulating those relations. In particular, in Australia, there's been a lot of moral panics around Muslims in the post-September 11 world, and so we'll be looking at that a little bit in the course on race and ethnicity, but also more generally in terms of globalisation, migration and refugees, and the push-pull factors that see it increasingly normal, people moving around the world quite rapidly. Implicit in the key sociological concepts of class, gender and race and ethnicity is the sociological concept of power. Power is conceived in various ways in sociology, in different sociological theories. Marxist theories tend to point out that the ruling class have most of the power. They're the ones that have the money, have the factories, or own Facebook and things like that today, and therefore have the most influence on the way that we live. Other understandings of power get us to think about how it's implicit in day-to-day world and day-to-day relations. For instance, a lecture theatre is set up with a power relationship in mind, where there's the podium out the front for the expert to stand in front of to talk about, whatever they're an expert in, and there's the uncomfortable chairs for everyone else to sit in and be quiet. The architecture of space there sets up a power relation between the student and the teacher, and also, in that kind of Goffman-esque sense, encourages a way of behaving in those situations. So sociologists are broadly interested in power in terms of class relations, gender relations, race relations, but also throughout society itself, more broadly, and throughout how institutions wield it or not. So we can ask questions here like, does money equal power? Does knowledge equal power? Does being on the media equal power? These are kind of broad areas of interest and research for sociologists to think about how power is dispersed throughout society.